This week we revisit a discussion of the DC series Starman featuring its author James Robinson. James talks with me and guest host Ryan Haupt about Starman's sneaky crossover with another series, a story arc that never happened, the differences in how the big two have dealt with their Golden Age characters, and much more. It's a flashback to episode 385 from January 6, 2014. First, I'd like to thank our patrons for helping to keep the show going. You can pitch in by pledging at least $2 a month at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim.
This is Ryan.
And this is James.
And this is Deconstructing Comics.
Didn't know what time it was, the lights were low.
Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo, joined this time by Ryan in Laramie, Wyoming, and James Robinson, writer of the comic we're going to talk about this week, Starman, and writer of many other comics as well. And James is in San Francisco. So welcome, you guys, and thanks especially to James for taking the time this evening.
My pleasure. I'm sure this will be a very illuminating and fun time.
Yeah, James, I had no idea you were involved with the 1984 science fiction fantasy film starring Jeff Bridges. This is exciting.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
That is what we're talking about, right? I watched the right thing?
Not a different James
Robinson. Yeah, sure. All right, good. I'm excited.
Okay. Yeah, so now Starman... Now, I should mention, I found that last year Comic Book Resources they had people voting on their favorite comic book runs, and Starman came in as number 11, up there with good company like the original Lee Ditko Spider-Man and stuff like that. So, good job.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's very interesting. It's very interesting to me because when I was writing the book, it felt like I was writing in a vacuum. I didn't know if anybody really liked it. And when there were signings, I would go to these signings and, for an hour or 2 hours, however long you're supposed to be there, and I would sign for 10 minutes and then sit there like a lemon for the rest of the time. So I don't know, so there was this whole sort of, whereas, other people had these runs of books coming out at the same time, and it was clear people were following them and excited by them. And so I always assumed that Starman was not really liked, but somehow or other it's stayed in people's hearts, and it seems to be almost more popular now than it was when I was writing the book, which is obviously very nice and very gratifying. Kind
of like the original Star Trek series, where it was moderately popular at the time, and then it blew up after it was canceled.
Well, you're comparing me, you're flattering me by comparing me to that, but yeah, I mean, if you want to make that analogy, I'll certainly accept it.
It's just something about titles with the word star in them.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I suppose that's true, yes.
So this series ran from October 1994 to August 2001, and I guess, Ryan and I were talking about this a little bit before we brought James into the call. I guess it was at least tangentially brought out of the 0 Hour event.
Well, that is actually not true.
Okay.
It's actually I had already wanted to do Starman, and I had talked to Archie about doing a Starman comic, knowing that what I was trying to do was do a comic that would have my identity on it, which I felt was a way to have people sort of recognize your work. This is a different time then, obviously, but I noticed that back in the day, Frank Miller did Daredevil, and that was bi-monthly. It was about to be cancelled, and Swamp Thing was about to be cancelled when Alan Moore took it over. Sandman was not well known. It was just a name, really, when Neil Gaiman came on board. And the same with Animal Man. He'd appeared, 5 or 6 stories in Strange Adventures, and then a couple of
appearances in Action Comics after that, but really no presence whatsoever. And the Doom Patrol 2 was on its way out when Grant took over. So my idea, it was obvious that the Will Payton Starman, no one liked the character, and I had sort of some ideas about it, and I suggested to Archie, I'd really like to take over that book, and obviously, that's the opportunity will present itself at some point, and he said, well, let's take the kill the character off, which they did in the Eclipso storyline. I forget what it was called, and so that freed me up. And I had already planned to kind of introduce a lineage element to Starman, which I could see was something that linked together, the Flashes and the Green Lanterns, and even Al Pratt and Ray Palmer had met a couple of times. There was a sense of a bond between them, but there was, at that point, there had been 5 or 6 Starmen, and they were all completely unrelated. They never met. There was no sense of a lineage. So that little spot, which is that two-parter where David Knight appears in the Will Payton comic, which got me thinking, and one thing led to another. And I'm rambling, but if you just want to hear all this, I'm quite happy to talk.
That's fine. Go ahead.
So I had already I knew the kind of book I wanted to do, and it was kind of like I'm really kind of shooting for the stars, but I really, no pun intended, but I really wanted to do like a Tom Waits book that felt like a Tom Waits song. And I had tried to get Wonder Man years ago at Marvel. And I had tried, and this was under, Bob Harris and what's her name, Bobby Chase, who had a very different sensibility to mine. And I wanted to do this guy that was, living in the sort of the low-rent Tom Waitsian world of Hollywood, trying to get movie roles, but having to be a superhero because that was sort of part of what it was. But having a real kind of like quick feel to it. And then I also, then Bobby Chase actually asked if I was interested in doing Doc Samson. And I had this whole sort of idea for something that was a much more sort of interesting and psychological, and I was going to, and I didn't realize it was happening in hindsight. I realized that there was a character that was sort of a secondary supporting character with an ambiguous morality to it, which was going to be the ringmaster from the Circus of Crime, and it was going to be set in San Francisco, but he was going to go back in time to Bedlam, and all this sort of interesting, dark stuff that as I said in other interviews, it's kind of gone from mainstream comics because of Vertigo. Books were either very serious or they were very superhero-y, in that mid ground, which was, Born Again and Mage and Black Hawk and all those things that inspired me, the Frank Miller and Alan Moore stuff. Really, people forget this, there really wasn't that stuff around at that point. It was really one extreme or the other. So I pitched that to Bobby Chase, and she was not having any of that. I don't know what the hell they ended up going with or what they ended up doing, but it certainly wasn't a Tom Waits interpretation of Doc Samson. So all of that stuff was in my head, and it all sort of came together with Jack Knight. And then the Shade, it wasn't that I was looking for a character to take the place of the Ringmaster. It just sort of happened that they both wore top hats, I guess. But that character... Oh, well, the Shade, I can tell you, that came about from one issue of the Flash that I think it was William Messner Loebs wrote. And it was an issue where the Rogues Gallery get together and to mourn or celebrate the life of Barry Allen. And because at that point they were portrayed as sort of a bunch of knuckleheads that get into basically fight. And it gets out of control, and the Flash ends up, telling them all to behave themselves. And then at the very end, you have the Shade, who was not actually ever really a Barry Allen villain. He kind of retroactively got yanked in, but he was actually Jay Garrick villain. He was an Earth 2 character. But when it all became One Earth, he kind of became part of this Rogues Gallery. And he's sitting on the curb in his weird, pointy elfy shoes and that old Shade outfit he used to have. And he's sort of like... contemplating on the genius of Barry Allen was that he had these heroes running around chasing him when if they just thought about it for a little bit more, they would have not paid him any mind, and they could have ruled the world with the powers they had if they'd just been smart. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, that's a very, it's a very interesting and elegant and eloquent thing to put onto Barry Allen. But it was the fact that it was a shade that was thinking this. It got me thinking about the shade. And then, looking at the DC Who's Who at the time, looking for villains, to give to Starman, I realized he had no past. He didn't even have another name. All the other villains had secret identity names. No one knew what he was, how his powers came about. For some reason, no one had bothered to do any of that groundwork. So it was all mine to take and make into the character that I ended up making him into.
I see.
And then we had Tony Harris, and that was, a very fortunate thing. I'd met him, and he had shown me some of his. He did a few of Nightbreed, the Clive Barker adaptation, and so his shadowy feel. I showed it to Archie, and we decided he was the guy. And one thing led to another.
So you mentioned Archie. That's Archie Goodwin, right?
Archie Goodwin, the editor and the guy. Oh, hang on a minute. Yes, it is Archie Goodwin, but the question, which was about Zero Hour, and we completely forgot what the question was. So basically, he had gotten me Starman, and we were doing the book, and it had been approved, and I had written like the first issue, and he said, "Hey, we're doing this in Zero, and they want to kind of retroactively fold Starman into these new heroes that we're going to create out of Zero Hour." So Zero Hour, it wasn't that they said, we're doing Zero Hour, we need to create a character. It was that the two things happened at once, but actually Starman would have happened without Zero Hour, and it was just timing, really.
I see. So there was sort of a coming attraction that they stuck into Zero Hour. Yes,
that was it was. I mean, Zero Hour was a pretty crappy crossover, so it was not that I was thought about that, but at least I was getting a monthly book, which I've been trying to get for a very long time.
I see. Yeah, well, you talked about sort of establishing the lineage of different Starmen. A lot of the series felt to me kind of. It reminded me of Avengers Forever, which was another kind of continuity repair job. Does that seem like a fair comparison?
Yes, it doesn't. Well, it doesn't. I don't quite see the comparison, but I do love. I think that could be my favorite work by Busiek under Marvels and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm certainly not offended by that. I mean.
Well, it kind of reminded me, we're explaining why this happened and who was doing this and how these two people are related.
I suppose that makes sense. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So, it definitely was that, and it was fun to do, and I had I was allowed to do it. I mean, it was, when I look back on my time doing Starman compared to my second period at DC, it's astounding the difference in terms of working. I mean, with Starman, I would basically pick every single fill-in issue. I picked the artist myself. I said, "So actually, can we use this guy or that guy?" And obviously, I didn't push my luck and try and go with Matt Howarth or someone that was like way out there. But not that I don't think. If anyone remembers Matt Howarth, he was a kind of a great artist at one time. But I don't think anyone remembers him. But any of those kind of people. But at the same time, they were all people I wanted to work with, and Archie was always cool about it. And he knew that I would always come up with a story that suited that person's style.
Mm-hmm.
So Teddy Christensen and Matt Smith, when he had who's now the Mr. Doctor Who. He does Doctor Who all the time, and he's great at it. But he, it was among his first work, and various people like that. So. The amount of freedom I had to do the stories I was allowed to tell was pretty amazing. Whereas, now, like, the yoke is on your back at everywhere, really, I suppose. I don't want to pick on DC, but you definitely do not get that kind of freedom anymore. Not on any. I don't think on any book at DC.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was interesting. I've just been binge reading it here the past couple of weeks. I had heard a lot about it before, but I'd never read it until just the past couple of weeks. it was interesting how it felt. Well, I wanted to ask you how much of this series was already more or less planned when you started, because it was pretty clear that a lot of it was.
Well, some of it was.
Okay.
I would say about 50%. And a lot of it, and this is something, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but this is a quote from an interview. He might have said this to me personally, I forget. But Neil Gaiman said this about Sandman. That he said Sandman was about 50% as well. You can't plan any more than that, I don't believe. Not on a big storyline.
Mm-hmm.
Some of it you plan, and some of it falls into place, and some of it you have to make up. Like, I'll give you an example. I was really proud of how I managed to get every single plot hole and why every single character was in the book. It all kind of made sense by the end of it.
Yeah, I couldn't find any threads that were left dangling. You
would have found one if I hadn't have remembered at the very last minute, which is that in issue 80, I realized that in the annual where the Shade is in the future talking to the children on the future planet, and he mentions the O'Dare that died saving Jack. And I realized that, yes, Barry O'Dare, the corrupt O'Dare, did die, but he didn't do it saving Jack. I was like, shit, I haven't done my job, So that was, and then I was like, well, who am I going to kill? And I was like, I don't really want to kill all of them. And then I thought, well, Mason O'Dare, and then out of nowhere, the whole thing came about where Mason O'Dare takes the arrow that was meant for Jack Knight, and Zatara, who had an affair with, I can't remember what everyone, I've got to remember this myself, it's been a while, who had an affair with what's her name? Charity, that's right.
Charity.
The fortune teller comes back from the grave, so to speak, as the wedding present to her, and resurrects Mason O'Dare. So
yeah.
It's a fantastic sequence, and Peter Snowden did such a beautiful job drawing it. But that was a plot hole that I completely overlooked, that they called it the very, very last minute. That wasn't even the 11th hour. That was 11:55.
Okay.
And I managed to catch it. And we had an extra large issue, so I had the room to insert that sequence, and it didn't affect any other sequence.
Okay, now, I was actually, maybe it's just because I'm not much of a DC reader, I was a little mystified by that point. I didn't understand who John was, who was in the picture on the wall.
That's John Zatara.
Okay.
That's Zatanna's dad, right?
Yes. And he was a magical character, Golden Age magical character, who first appeared in Action number 1, the first issue of along with Superman.
Mm-hmm.
And he sort of was resurrected. Back in the 60s, they kind of cherry-picked which characters were Earth 2 characters and which characters, for some reason, appeared on Earth 1 and were part of Earth 1 continuity, but just had been around in the 40s. And that was how you got, like, Zatara, and then his daughter was Zatanna, and she was this, figure in modern-day DC, and he was sort of semi-retired, and then in a big sort of supernatural arc in Swamp Thing, involving all of the mages of the DC universe, Alan Moore killed him off. So he was dead by that point. But that was John Zatara, who had an affair with a very young Charity when she was young, and they had become friends afterwards.
Okay.
So hence he had the magic and was able to do what he did and bring back Mason.
Okay. Yeah, even though I just read all of this, some of it might have gotten past me. Did that come up in an earlier issue? I kind of remember Zatanna being mentioned.
The affair, yes. I forget. No, I'd have to think about it. It's either I think it's Jack. It wouldn't be nice because that would be weird. Her talking about her ex-lovers to him, but I think it was Jack. But he says he's bad, and she explains who he is and the fact that they had been lovers, but then they realized they were better friends than lovers, and now he was dead, and she kind of kept that as a memory of him.
Okay.
So yes, it was all explained.
Okay.
That leads nicely into talking about legacy in general, though, because, Zatanna takes up the legacy of her father, Jack takes up the legacy of his father, and legacy in general is such an important concept in the Starman book. Do you have any, did you have, a big overarching theme behind the idea of legacy in the book, or did you kind of just play with it individually with each character?
Well, no, I mean, it became fun to do that. I mean, it was the idea. I mean, really, it was the father and son. I mean, it wasn't. It would have had a different feel if there had been a Starman prior to Ted Knight, but he was the first Starman. So it was sort of that. It was all the Starmen that came between the father and the son that made it into this book of legacy involving all these different characters. But if there had just been one Starman, and I'd done the events for Jack, then it would have just been the two of them. It would have been a completely different book, I guess. It might not have been quite as interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of what I dealt with was stuff that I've been, dumped on my plate, like the Blue Starman. Oh, that was the other thing you should know is that the other thing that factored into it, in that I'm not sure exactly when I would have chosen to, if at all, to bring in all these different Starmen. But at the very beginning, they had, for some reason, they hadn't had success with a character called Starman ever. They'd always been, it not very well received, and I believed it was because there was no link between them. But as a result, Mike Carlin, and back then the way that DC worked is you had Archie Goodwin, who was the group editor of a lot of the DC books. Then you had Mike Carlin, who was in charge of all the Superman books, and you had Denny O'Neil, who was in charge of all the Batman books. And although they had a degree, there were sort of these three fiefdoms who treated each other with, mutual respect. It was all very, these are cool guys, all of them. But they did have to kind of sign off on each other's. And I think it was two of them had to sign off or something like that. I forget how it worked, but you couldn't just go roughshod on your own and do whatever you wanted. There was a degree of culpability, and you had to, agree on things. So Mike Carlin was like, look, obviously I trust you, Archie. If you think this is the great book, we're going to go with it. But let's just do a mini-series because it might just be a complete failure like every other Starman book. So knowing that, I'd written it so that issue 4, where you have the 2 pages that show the Starman is which one? You show Will Payton in space, and then you have the 2 pages that show Mikhail in the circus, were there as deliberate cliffhangers, just in case. But I think as the first issue or the first 2 issues of Art came in, and Mike Carlin, who hadn't really read a lot of my work, read the script. He was like, fuck it, let's make it a monthly book, and it'll be fine. So it ended up not needing to matter, but that was why I had those pages in the first books. It was just to get readers excited in case it was a miniseries, and so I think that helped to keep my thought process going in terms of the idea of all these different characters and how everything linked up and everything else.
Okay, so yeah, were you showing the two other Starmen in captivity in various locations? Yeah, that happens really early on.
Yeah.
We don't get back to the one in space for quite a few issues.
Well, quite a few issues for many years. I mean, I knew he had to go into space, but it was, and it ultimately worked out perfectly because, Tony was sort of like moving on and wanting to do other things. Mm-hmm. So it was the perfect top, place to train artists. But yeah, I mean, I knew that would be when we get into that. Yeah, it was a while. It was what, 3 years, three or maybe 4 years before we
yeah, it must have been. Mm-hmm. Well, and yeah, getting back to legacy, we also have the O'Dare family and all these children of their father worked with the original Starman as police chief, was he?
Red O'Dare, yes, he became the police chief.
It's interesting to me that
he was like one of the cops.
Interesting to me that you had him have so many children. What was the idea behind having so many O'Dares?
I don't remember, honestly.
It was a while back, yes.
Yeah, I just, I mean, some of these things just sort of like pop in your head. I don't know. I think I got the idea. How did I get this idea? I know that Tony just put this cop with the big, like, Sam Elliott mustache in it as one of the children.
Mm.
And that started me thinking about Scalp Hunter and Western characters.
Mm.
I mean, I don't remember exactly why I did that, but I know that it came pretty early because it was intrinsic to the next arc. What was it? Sins of the Father, so Sins of the Child, which was where it was that same day played over again and again from different points of view. So I haven't had my royalty check from Matt Fraction, by the way, for his latest run of Hawkeye. I should get on to him about that. That's a joke. But he just did the same thing recently, and I just realised. So it was early on, but I have no idea. I just don't remember why I did it. Why I did that. I remember giving. Did I come up with Hope O'Dare? I think I might have come up with Hope O'Dare because I had just become friends with Amanda Connor, and she had been bemoaning the fact that she couldn't get any superhero work, and she couldn't get work at Archie Comics.
Mm.
So I said, I will get you some superhero work. I can only get 3 pages, but so the first superhero work is me. I got that from Amanda.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that inspired me to come up with Hope O'Dare, but I don't remember. So I could lie to you, and I probably have already in the conversation, but
yeah, but you said it with confidence, so it's fine.
Yes, so I think you do that, yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about Hope O'Dare is, I mean, it's kind of unusual, and it's not a bad thing at all. Maybe it's a good thing, but to have an attractive female character who doesn't function as a love interest for anybody.
Yes, she had a go. I mean, she ended up
with Shade. Yeah.
Okay.
But that was at the very end. And even at the end of the series, you didn't really know what was going on there. It just kind of like hit it up, kind of liked each other because they were so different from each other.
Mm.
But that wasn't her main purpose by any means, was as a love interest. No, it was always just a strong female character. I don't know. It just I look back on some of the things they did in that book, and I didn't realize I was doing anything that was so outrageous. Even the gay stuff, I didn't realize I was. It was only when I did the gay Alan Scott in Earth 2 recently that I was looking back and I guess I did kind of do some things that no one had done before.
Yeah, that was something I really wanted to bring up was, because we're talking about Mikhail Tomas, one of the Starman. The Starman of the 70s is kind of how I think of him, the blue alien one. But you made him a gay character, but it was one of those, I thought, really elegant ways of handling it where it wasn't a big flashy, oh my gosh, he's gay. It was just like, this is an aspect of the character that was there, and you just kind of let it be.
It came up in passing.
Right, and you just kept telling your story, which I think is a really mature way to handle that topic.
Well, thank you. Well, that is, I grew up in a very arty, aspect. I went to art college and film school and whatnot, and, the clubs in London and everything else. So, I had a lot of gay friends, and it never was like, hey, I'm John and I'm gay, it was just like, hey, this is John. So I think I had that kind of attitude anyway.
But I think it's possible that you underestimate how that kind of casual, it's not such a big deal attitude affected probably a lot of the readers at the time who were coming to these concepts of people like that in the real world as just a thing, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess maybe. But the other thing I think subliminally or subconsciously, I may have done it that way to not draw attention to it because I didn't want to deal with any kind of editorial, And Archie was cool, but you never knew, it still was a company that was owned by Warner Brothers. Less so. It felt less like it was owned by Warner Brothers then, but it was still owned by Warner Brothers, or Time Warner, I should say. So I think that might have been a part of it, but I'm glad it all worked out, and I'm glad that I do know that Starman has quite a big gay following, and I do talked to gay guys that have said to me that, you know, it kind of meant a great deal to them. So that's a fantastic thing that I'm very proud of.
Now, didn't how do you pronounce it? Mikhail Thomas? Didn't he also end up having a girlfriend at another point though? And it was like, you know, I'm an alien, so it's
Well, it was. I mean, it was at times bisexual. I mean, he definitely tried both sides of the menu, but by the end, he sort of, in my heart, he was gay. Pretty much by the time he was with Tony, in my mind, he was gay. But he definitely in the 70s had an experimental period where he was trying everything, as I'm sure many did in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I think in reading the series the first time through for me, that first issue with Mikhail, where it's a flashback, well, I guess not the first issue, but the first issue where we learn his history, where it's that flashback to the 70s, you see him using drugs, and then he has that mental battle with the person from his planet, where they're both just sitting at the table the whole time, but it's this huge thing. I think that was the moment for me I realized that this comic was doing something radically different than any other superhero comic I'd read before.
Looking back, I can't believe... Again, that didn't occur to me at the time, but I can't believe that they let me have... He's doing cocaine on the first page of a mainstream comic. Like, quite clearly doing cocaine in a bathroom. I can't believe they let me get away with that. And I will say this. I said to the artist, at the moment where he kills the other guy in the battle, he says, I said, I want you to draw it like we are watching two men having gay sex. I remember that's the script. So, I mean, I definitely wanted that sexual, that 70s, sexy 70s, anything goes, gay, straight, drugs, flared pants lifestyle to be front and foremost in that particular book. And luckily, you know, the artist Craig is gay, so he was more than happy to do anything, you know, to do all of that. He wasn't, it wasn't like I took a young artist from the Midwest who just left his, you know, church school to get into comics.
So Craig Hamilton. Okay.
Yeah, he was up for it, so that was good.
Okay. And also on the legacy theme is the fact that Jack is a junk collector or a collector of what's the right word for it? Just kind of pop culture stuff from over the years.
Collectibles, yes. Pop culture collectibles.
And you must have...
That was me, really. That was just me, and because at the time I was collecting so many different things. I was a bit of a sort of addicted.
Okay. Well, I wondered because it seems the description of the things that he's collecting seems very informed, and I thought you must have had to do a lot of research.
No, it was just all the things. And if you have read Starman through the collections, what you won't be aware of is that for about 30 issues or so, 35, until it just became too much work, I would answer all of the letters on the letters pages personally.
Mm.
And I said, you know, I want this to be a discourse about anything you want. You don't have to write in about the issue. If you want to write in about a movie you've enjoyed or an old, you know, collectibles and an old books and anything you want, send in letters. Mm. So the letters page was sort of almost a continuation of Jack's world in terms of the collecting and everything else. So that's why it's such an intrinsic part of who he is, because it was an intrinsic part of who I was, and it was also an intrinsic part of enjoying Starman as a reader was the letters pages and the community aspect of it that I think a lot of people responded to.
I see. Okay.
Well, I also remember there was that scene in one of the early issues where Copperhead goes into the radio collectible shop.
Yes.
And I loved that scene. And so rarely do you get a scene like that where it's, the tension is palpable, but it's just, it shows the villain reflecting against the hero in a way that you so rarely get in superhero comics, especially to that level of depth and subtlety. I loved that scene.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I kind of I've lost that neck in the last few years. I can see that, but hopefully with the DC books, you'll see me. With the Marvel books that I'm doing now, you'll see me being able to inject a little bit of that personal stuff back in. You know.
Yeah, I mean, you don't usually see a villain concerned with anything other than his evil plans. And here he's like, I'm just collecting stuff. I'm kind of a normal guy.
Yeah, Copperhead is an interesting. Well, at the time it was interested in the character only because he's one of the few characters that first appeared in the issue of Brave and the Bold. That's where he had his origin. He was in a team up with, I think it was Batman and Wonder Woman. So, and that doesn't really mean anything now, but back then, villains that then went on to appear in the DC universe as a whole just didn't first appear in an issue of Brave and the Bold. And I just thought that, for what that's worth, it always stuck in my head, and it was kind of interesting, snaky and venomous. But I don't know, I just always thought it was cool.
Also, talking about legacy, in Volume 3, the Sand and Stars arc was like all about legacy with these other, I guess, Golden Age heroes, the original Sandman, and that reading that reminded. I'm sorry. Right, yeah. See, I don't know the Golden Age characters very well, and I wasn't sure who she was actually. I guess, but she has a long history.
Yes, I mean she was his girlfriend from the very beginning. Sandman is a very, very old character.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you don't know is that at DC at the time, the Karen Berger wanted nothing to do with DC. She considered it beneath her. So the characters that were at DC, she didn't want crossovers with her characters at all. And this irked me and Matt Wagner, who was writing Sandman Mystery Theater at the time, which was a book set in the 1940s.
Was that a Vertigo book?
If it wasn't a Vertigo book, it was a DC book. But even the DC books, she wanted nothing to do with DC.
Okay, so basically the books that Karen Berger was editing, which included the Sandman Mystery Theater, she wanted kept separate.
Yes. So this irks me and Matt. Matt really is. Matt. I did a Graphic Novel London stuff, but Matt read that in its black and white kind of pre-publication form and offered me Grendel Tales. So he really, has offered me the first work I did, and in America, and I've known him that long. So we've been friends forever. So it irked us. So he did an arc of Sandman Mystery Theater called The Mist. That is kind of a prequel to the Sand and Stars arc. And it was very oblique, but we did that deliberately, and I thought we planned it and everything else. And that's why Guy Davis does that Times Past little 10-page story with, isn't it interesting, the things that no one knows? That's why Guy Davis did the 10-page story in Starman. It was to link it all together with Sandman Mystery Theater.
The Guy Davis part. I was going to comment, I don't think I've ever seen Guy Davis work in a superhero comic before. That was cool.
Well, that was why, because he was the current artist. He was the artist at the time on the Sandman Mystery Theater comic.
Okay, but that appeared in the DC Starman, that segment by him.
Yes, but the prequel that was set in the and Ted Knight is in it. It is in the Mist, is in the story before he's Starman.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was all meant to tie together. So if you want the full Sand and Stars Starman experience, read that arc, which is available as I think is a trade paperback. Before you read Sand and Stars, you'll get an even bigger, more fleshed out story.
I see. Okay. Now, reading Sand and Stars, it reminded me of Watchmen in a way, because it's the same kind of feeling of like these elderly heroes from an earlier time and talking about how they sort of miss the life of being a superhero and how the danger was kind of a sexual turn on, and in some cases passing on their mantle to their son or daughter, and that person following in their footsteps. It felt a lot. It reminded me of that in a lot of ways.
Well, that was, I think, me taking from what Matt Wagner was doing in Sandman Mystery Theater at the time, because he made, his idea was, as blatantly as he could, but also surreptitiously as he could, where he had to be, rather, making Wesley Dodds and Diane Belmont sexual creatures.
Mm-hmm.
So he, and it really was the first place in. I'm trying to think if I just did it or if I was. I guess because Earth 1 and Earth 2 joined together, I was able to fudge the history. But originally, Roy Thomas killed off Diane Belmont at the time when Sandman, for a period of time, had a purple and yellow costume, which actually you see him in that in the Guy Davis flashback.
Mm-hmm.
And then Matt was like, no, I see them like that they're still together as old people and they're still sexy. So with that in mind, that's sort of what I added to it and fleshed out upon, and the idea that as you get old, I mean, once you get older, you don't feel old, you know. You know, that's why old people, I think, are so sad, is that they have young brains in these old bodies that are no longer what they used to be.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to get a lot of that across, you know, as well. You know, and, you know, again, you compare it to Watchmen. Thank you. You're certainly.
I'm piling on the praise here.
Laying on the sugar tonight, aren't you?
James, I honestly feel like I'm holding back talking about how much I fucking love Starman. Like it really is some of the pinnacle superhero comics for me. And the only reason I don't recommend it to people more is because it's such a layered and nuanced story that I'm kind of like, you probably need to spend, 5 years reading comics to be able to even start approaching Starman, and which is nonsense, because I've given it to people who've read far less comics and they've devoured it. So it's
I mean, I enjoyed it even though I didn't really know the continuity at all outside of this series. There were a lot of references I didn't get, especially towards the end, or there's something about Jack, involved in something with, I don't know, the JSA or something. I had no idea what that was, but just kind of, okay, well, whatever, that's something else. But yeah,
that was me relaunching the Justice Society, and so I felt I was obligated to put Jack Knight in it, but I also knew that I was going to be ending the book soon, so he was only actually in the Justice Society for like a few issues, and then he left. Obviously there were aspects like that where it went into the main DC universe, but a lot of the time they left me alone to just do what I wanted to do. What was I just going to say? I forget. I don't know. Okay, well, let's keep talking. Maybe it'll come to me.
There's one kind of joke question that I have wanted to ask you is that was passing in the cosmic rod meant to be a literal passing of the torch? Was that pun in your head the whole time writing that?
No, it was. Well, not really. I mean, at the time, I was definitely going to take a break from comics for a bit. And I knew that Jeff wasn't, and I'd helped him get into the business and all of that. But it was also that I knew that while Stargirl had the cosmic rod, no one else could have it. And I just wanted to put all the pieces away that I wanted. I didn't want anyone bringing back Jack. I mean, DC was very. I mean, it doesn't matter now because it's all new. If they brought back Jack Knight, it wouldn't be the same character. But they were very good to retire the character when I didn't want to do it anymore, and they didn't try and keep it going, and they could have. They could have put another artist on. I mean, after I left, or another writer rather.
Mm-hmm.
So but at the same time, I didn't want someone else getting the cosmic rod and just sort of And you know how it is. Every writer thinks they can do better than the last one, and there are no sacred cows that they feel should be left alone.
The next writer would have made Jack Knight extreme.
or something, yeah.
With lots of pouches.
It would have all been fucked up. So basically, but I knew that if I gave the cosmic rod to Jeff, then that kind of keeps the character, keeps the star aspect alive. So there isn't a need for someone else to do a new Starman because there was a Stargirl.
Yeah, who was she?
So that was.
I didn't know who she.
That was Courtney Whitmore.
Courtney.
Who was Star Spangled Kid. There was a book called Star and Stripe.
Stripe was her stepdad.
Her stepdad, Pat Dugan, from the original Seven Brothers of Victory. So she then became the new Stargirl and became this main figure in the in the Justice Society comic book.
Okay. Coming up, James talks about how DC handled their Golden Age characters differently from how Marvel did it. We visit Opal City and talk more about the Shade. James lets us in on a story that was supposed to happen in Starman but didn't, and much more. This podcast is part of the Deconstructing Comics Network, where we're grateful to our supporters on Patreon. Patrons get exclusive extra content. Pledge $2 a month or more and get Batman 66 podcast Bat Bits and occasional trivia videos. Most recently, we presented trivia about 90125, the 1983 album from Yes. Coming up, we'll discuss early drafts of the script for The Bookworm Turns. At $4 a month, you also get our new monthly show, Silver Age Batman, where I'm moving through the book Batman in the 50s issue by issue, with a rotating second chair of Paul, Emmett, Patrick, or Kumar. Follow our Patreon for free, and you can hear the first 2 episodes of Silver Age Batman. Check it out at patreon.com/deconcomics, and thanks for your support.
Hello, I'm Ken Holtzhauser, and if you're looking for something new in comic books, may I recommend my newest comic, The Quick and the Dad, a love letter to the DC, Marvel, Archie, and Harvey comics of my youth. This comic has everything. It has spaceships, dad jokes, alien invasions, time travel, supervillains, and so many bad puns. Hopefully you'll like it. It's the cutest comic you've never heard of, and it's available today in print and digital from indieplanet.com. That's The Quick and the Dad. Join that other dynamic duo, won't you?
Another thing that occurred to me reading Sand and Stars was that comparing Marvel and DC, it seems like, well, this is not completely true, but a lot of the heroes, the Golden Age heroes of DC have been, they've become part of the past, and then there are different people maybe carrying on as the Flash or Starman or whoever, where in Marvel they always seem to find a way to have the same guy who was, say, Captain America in the 1940s still be Captain America now. I can't think of really any sort of, well, of course I wasn't around in the 40s, but Marvel characters who have become part of just the Marvel past.
Well, that's true. I mean, I think, well, the difference is that, I mean, this is all based around what happened in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Because in the 60s, in the 60s, Atlas Comics were going bankrupt. They literally had enough money to keep going for a couple more months. And they decided to do superheroes again, which had been kind of failing for them. They hadn't been doing superheroes since the 50s, when they had when they tried to do Captain America, Torch, and Submariner again, and they had a new character called Marvel Boy. So apart from that, they had been doing monster books and Western comics and romance comics.
Mm-hmm.
So they started with Fantastic Four and Spider-Man, and they basically created this whole new world.
Yeah.
And out of that, then they did an issue of Strange Tales where this acrobat dressed up like Captain America as a villain or something, I forget. And it was so popular seeing the Captain America back that that's why they had the idea of bringing back Captain America in issue 4 of the Avengers.
Mm-hmm.
And that was really the first link to the past. And then they brought back Submariner, I think, around the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And then they eventually brought back the Torch and deactivated him because they already had a Torch in
Fantastic Four.
Fantastic Four. So there weren't all these other Golden Age characters around. It was a completely new universe that really started in the 60s with this kind of vague reference to the 1940s. There wasn't this whole world of 1940s continuity. Whereas at DC, where they had all these books that they cancelled. The Flash was cancelled, Green Lantern was cancelled, and Julie Schwartz said, well, these are good characters, let's do new versions. And then one day, they decided to have the two Flashes meet and explain why they'd never met before and all of that, and you had the two different Earths. And so it brought all of that Golden Age continuity back to life. Whereas, really, if you look at the Marvel stuff, you had the fact that, yes, basically in continuity, the Torch existed, Captain America existed, and Namor existed. But even when Rick Jones brings back some 1940s heroes at the end of the Krog-Skreed War, is it just, did you get none of this stuff? I know I'm bringing up all these different bits of the past. I mean, it's pretty vague. But when he brought them back, he doesn't say, I brought back Golden Age characters. He says, I brought back comic book characters I remember reading from my youth, from my childhood. So even then, he's not officially saying these characters existed. And it was, and then I think Red Raven, who's an old Golden Age character, appears for an issue. They always bring these characters back to kill them off, or turn them into like crazy people and stuff. There was no, Marvel had no respect for the Golden Age characters. Even the Torch, who, I mean, it's something that I'm dealing with now, like I'm writing Invaders. The Torch is the very first Marvel hero. Mm-hmm. Predates Captain America, but they killed him off. They depowered him. They buried him in the desert. There was never a real reverence for their golden age until Roy Thomas did the Invaders comic in the late 70s, early 80s, and started to bring it and started to make sense of this continuity. While at the same time he was very smart about it, I think, in that he made it very clear in the Invaders comic that the continuity that the old Golden Age comics, because they contradict themselves and the stories are goofy and stupid, and the art isn't very good, to be honest, in a lot of the Golden Age Marvel books. He said that these were comic books written about real people in the 1940s. So he said, so that basically gave him some wiggle room to make things a little bit more interesting and mature. There was a very short-lived hero called the Human Top that they had, and he turned that into like a young black character. And there was a character called Golden Girl, and he could turn into a Japanese American character. Saying, there's no way that in the 40s they would have had that character as a Japanese American, so they had a white version. So he was sort of, he was doing more modern stuff, allowing himself that freedom, and that's really when the continuity of Marvel in the past started to come together. There was even the first time that they explained how Captain America, because there was a Captain America in the 50s, and yet Captain America was killed off in the 40s. Not killed off, but he appeared to be killed off, frozen in ice, and came back in the 1960s. So who was that 50s character? Roy Thomas, in a what-if story, explained, all these different Captain Americas and how it all works in terms of linking them together. So it was only then that the idea of a lineage between the Captain Americas, which became the bedrock of, Ed Brubaker's amazing Captain America run that he did for 5 or 6 years. All of this came much later at Marvel, which is why you see the difference in how the two versions of the Golden Age are treated. Whereas at DC, that Golden Age, the moment that the Justice League met the Justice Society, all of that past continuity became real and became something that was a part of the big picture. Okay.
Now, Batman and Superman were never canceled, right? They went straight through the 50s into the 60s?
Well, what happened was, Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman were never canceled. And they also were in Action Comics and Detective Comics. And that is why a couple of these characters kind of like limped into the 50s in a way that put them into the Silver Age and onto Earth 1. Like Green Arrow never had his own comic book. Not back then. He was always a backup character. But because he happened to be a backup character in Action Comics, or maybe I lie. It might have been in Adventure Comics. He was a backup character. But because he was a backup character, he didn't get cancelled like the Jay Garrick Flash did or the Alan Scott Green Lantern did. So he was just around to become a character to join the Justice League. Okay. And it was only later on they had to explain, there was actually an Earth 2 version that was sent back in time or whatever in issue 100 of Justice League. No, I can literally talk about this shit all day. So I know
sounds like it.
Some of this is probably gutsy. I'm trying not to be condescending or rude. I get the impression that you're not as up to date on this as I am. So some of this may be going over your head, and I guarantee you there will be listeners that will be nodding their heads and going, "Yeah, that's right."
No, it's interesting to me since I have not, like I said, I've not really been a DC reader at any point. Yeah, so that's why there's no like Golden Age Batman versus the modern Batman. There wasn't a different guy besides Bruce Wayne.
No, they had to explain that. So at some point, they had to explain. Well, if there's a 20-year-old Flash and a 40-year-old Flash, and Batman did appear in one issue of All-Star Comics.
Mm-hmm.
There has to have been a Earth 2 Batman. So the first acknowledgement of that, and it was, at the time it was pretty mind-blowing. I would imagine it was slightly before my time, but for readers, was you didn't have an Earth 2 Batman joining the Justice League, but you had an adult Robin. And he said, "I know Bruce Wayne's retired, but I'm now the sort of Batman character." And he had this odd, in hindsight, really weird costume, which was sort of a mixture of the yellow of Robin with the Batman costume and a weird sort of bat mask that was. Anyway, you had to see it to believe it. But but they acknowledged, that there was and then you had an Earth 2 Superman that had his S was slightly different, and he had white sideys on his, white sides to his hair where it had gone grey.
Mm.
Yeah,
so
the serif on the S was much longer.
What?
It is. That is one of the key distinctions. Just being a font nerd right now.
and then they had an Earth 2 Wonder Woman, and they ultimately did explain that there were two of the Batman, Superman, and Wonder Woman as well, but it was something that they realized a little bit after the fact they needed to explain. At the time that they first introduced Jay Garrick in the Flash of Two Worlds, I don't think that was on the forefront of their minds.
Sort of related, not exactly, but I think there was something in here in the series referring to like space exploration that like actually took place in the real world, like the Mercury astronauts or something. And I was
maybe,
and I was just wondering. I know this is kind of sort of off topic, but it just makes me think: would that really happen in a universe where there's superheroes too? Like, why would these sort of pedestrian, non-superpowered things go on? I mean, it seems like they would have been changed monumentally from what our world experienced.
Yes, but you can't. That's something. If I scratch that, if you look at the Marvel DC universe, there's no need for a NASA space program. You have, the JLA satellite is enough of a thing that doesn't exist on our real world. Moon bases and Superman can fly to other planets and whatever. Yeah. Oh yes. And the same with Marvel, where they go into space. Yeah, there's no need for astronauts. But I do, at the same time, I could probably argue that in the 60s, when superheroes, there really wasn't much evidence of superheroes in the 1940s or 50s going into space. So in the 60s, prior to superheroes and that world really taking hold of the DC universe, I could definitely argue that, and also the Marvel universe, there was not really a lot of space travel before. There wasn't any really before the Fantastic Four, flew up into space and got bashed with the cosmic rays. So the Mercury 7 happened, they went into space in the early 60s.
And in the first issue of Fantastic Four, they state directly, I know it's a different continuity than the DC stuff, but they are trying to beat the Russians. Like, that is part of the narrative.
So the space race, I'm just mad for the Mercury 7 and the Gemini Project and the right stuff. I've seen the right stuff a million times, and I've read the book a million times. So it was just me referencing that sort of thing. But I could argue with you that yes, there would have been the Mercury 7 and maybe even the Gemini Project. But I guess by the time of the moon landing, we could have just sent Superman there.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, just send him with the flag.
Yes, and then then at Marvel, I guess you could argue. Who was going into space at that time? The Fantastic Four went into space a bit, and no one else did. No one else went into space until for a little while, for a good few years. So you can get into Mercury 7. It all starts to get a bit hinky with Apollo, really, I guess.
I feel like Hal Jordan was kind of supposed to be in that kind of Chuck Yeager
Oh yeah, it was definitely a Chuck Yeager type test pilot character. Absolutely. I mean, flight was still glamorous and exciting to people.
Test pilots were the top of the pyramid.
Yeah, they were. Well, I mean, and it was still where people, put on suits and nice and their best dresses to fly. It was a special thing. Now you're lucky if you wear pants, But yeah. So I mean, if you want to get pedantic about real technology and fake technology, which literally, if you start thinking about it, it'll drive you nuts. So it's best just not even think about it. But right, I do believe the Mercury 7 could have existed.
Yeah. So getting back to Legacy and Starman, one other point about that. So the Mist's daughter becomes the new Mist, and Jack becomes the new Starman. And somehow, I'm not sure if this is biologically possible, but while he's knocked out, she conceives a child with him. I'm not sure if that could happen.
Hang on, wait. You're not sure if you can have sex while you're unconscious? Yeah, of course you can.
Okay.
Clearly,
you've never been at some of the parties I've been to.
Yeah, Tim, you've never woken up after a night that you barely remember to realize that things may have happened. It's okay, Tim. I'll explain it to you after we're done.
But I mean, was he? I guess he was more kind of. I was reading that sequence again. I guess he was more just kind of drugged, right? It wasn't completely unconscious, exactly.
But what's your question, Tim?
Well, I guess my question was what was the thought of having the two of them have a child? Were you just kind of trying to merge the legacies there?
No, my goal was to show that she was so fucked up that she had a child just to have something to hold over Jack.
Yeah.
So that was my goal, and then it quickly became there was the whole, the idea of, when Charity says, you going for a drive, I was like, oh, that's my final page. I've got that there. That was when I started to put together the big picture. But, part of it was just like she was going to have a child to hold over him in the future.
Yeah. Now,
is it time to talk about Opal?
Yeah, exactly. Read my mind. I was going to go to Opal City here. Which is really as much of almost the main character as much as Jack is. Now, is Opal, I assume, was mentioned in the original Starman comics?
No, it was. That's completely made up by me.
Oh, okay.
And at the time, I mean, I will take full credit for this, and I will fight someone physically who disagrees. But if you look at the time, DC was kind of like a little bit dead in the water. Nobody, I mean, prior to Starman, by like five or 10 years, DC was a little bit dead in the water. And it was really like, Marv Wolfman coming to, like, bringing a real, like, Marvel sensibility to the Teen Titans that began to get DC interesting again. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things he did, though, is he made it very real in terms of, like, Manhattan, and it became like a real place in the way that Marvel has always had them in real cities.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember thinking, I remember sort of missing the idea of, how Ivy Town was Boston and Central City was Chicago, and all these different places were meant to be allegories for other cities.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, fuck it, I'm going to create a fictional city and like really make it into this unique place. And so I came up with Opal City, and the idea there was this Victorian Center and the Art Deco around it and everything else. But then immediately after that, you had Aztec and Grant Morrison and Martin Millar created their own city, and The Question had its own city, and all these other people suddenly little fictional cities.
Hawkman had his own city.
Who did?
Hawkman.
Well, Hawkman did originally. That was
did he
Midway
really?
City. Yeah, that was Midway City. I'm not even sure where that was supposed to be.
But
Midway,
Jeff Johns' run gave him like a fake New Orleans kind of city in Louisiana.
We co-plotted those first issues. Yeah, that was us trying to do a new thing, and yeah, it was meant to be the DC New Orleans,
Which was great. I loved it.
So we were constantly trying to like people. All these people were doing all these cities, but yeah, I think I was the first one that really embraced the idea of the fictional city and brought it back into being an aspect of the DC universe, and I'll stand by that. So yeah, and then the idea became its own city, and I remember doing my inept way of trying to do kind of a Tom Waits riff when I did that sort of little description of life in Opal in issue 5 with the captions and what was going on, and it did take its own. It did take on an identity for me too as I was writing it. I had a lot of fun writing that, and then of course Tony did the math. He got into designing the buildings, and it all, it kind of began to feed itself almost,
Well, I've said publicly before, and by publicly I mean on other podcasts, that if I had to move to a city in a comic book world, Opal City is my first choice.
It seems to be a very cultured place.
I would want to go there too. Yeah, cultured place. I think there's a lot more suits. I think a lot more people still wear suits and they stretch to fly when they live in Opal City.
But it's also just the way that like the Shade, as written by you, talks about this city, and he's a transplant, and I've lived in a ton of different places in my life, so like I never have felt rooted to a single place, and so just the fact that like this guy who's a transplant, who's immortal, finds such solace in this one city, and it's got all these coffee houses and outdoor cafes and the Art Deco-ness of it all, and it actually seems like one of those cities where you could get out to the countryside relatively easily, which is important for me as kind of an outdoorsy person. I love Opal. It's
I think when I was writing it, I was trying to write the city I'd like to live in, basically.
Well, you and I should move to Opal then.
Yeah, Opal, exactly. Yeah. You should open a collectible store and I'll come and buy stuff from you.
As long as there's a university for me to go do some research on, I'm happy.
There you go.
Maybe they have different fossils there that you can find, Ryan.
Exactly. The legacy. Yeah. It's all about legacy, Tim.
And you get credit for these great discoveries. Yeah.
So anyway, yeah. So that was the creation of Opal, and you're right. It has lived on, and people talk as fondly about Opal as they do about the characters within it. And I was very glad to kind of have a little bit of it come back in the Stray, although. It's interesting that DC is now not reprinting any of this stuff, so it's all going to go out of print. So I'm glad you got to read it all while you could.
Can we talk about the Shade a little bit?
Yes, you want to.
Well, hang on a second. Hang on a second. I had one question about Opal. How did it happen that it has no suburbs? It's just like city and then country.
That's the best part about it.
Like, did aliens transplant it there? Or?
No. I just thought that was cool. It's just like, again, if you want to, it was the suburbs were stolen along with the Apollo space program. If you want to worry about those things, it's a comic book.
It's kind of like Emerald City.
But I did like the idea. Well, I did like the idea that there is. You just kind of like one day the buildings stop and then you just drive out and there's just country. It just seems cool to me.
Okay, Ryan. Sorry, go ahead.
No, well, one, I love that there are no suburbs. I think that's one of the reasons it's my favorite city in comics is that I just love. It's like maybe rivaled by Astro City, but that's high praise. I think the question I wanted to ask was I wanted to talk a little bit about the Shade because from what I'd heard previous to this interview is that Jack Knight was in some ways an amalgam of you and Tony Harris, but the Shade you've infused, and I know we talked about his origin a little bit, but the way you wrote him and the personality you gave him and the history and the depth, and not just in his past but in his future, felt so personal. I would just love to hear a bit more about how you contrast the Shade with Jack Knight and that kind of that character.
Well, I mean, I guess it's different aspects. I guess if I wanted to be, really get into analyzing what I've done, and I'm always wary of being pretentious when I say things, but I guess if I have to be honest, I think Jack Knight is the person I'm more like, and the Shade is the person I wish I was like. He's sort of, witty, he's very witty, he's stylish, I'm quite frankly those things, but he's more so. And he's lived, he's seen, he's just sort of this person I kind of admire. He's in the same way that you get those like perfect characters that don't exist in real life, like James Bond, and James Bond and whoever else. I can't think of anyone else off the top of my head, but you know what I'm saying. The Shade is that kind of person, whereas Jack Knight, his imperfections, I think, are what made him resonate with readers and appeal to readers. So I think that's sort of where the Shade came from. And then as the book, I really wanted him to be this. I was hugely influenced at the time I created him by a book called Gloriana by Michael Moorcock, which is a book. When it's supposed to be set, is a little bit vague in that it's not really clear if it's in the present day or if it's in like the 1800s, but it's definitely, it's as if the Elizabethan Empire has lived on. So it's like the Elizabethan Empire has been updated into a much later period of time, and and there's intrigue and drama and whatnot. But there is a character, now I've forgotten his name, but the main sort of male character in it is this guy who is absolutely amoral, and yet you like him all the more for it. And that appealed to me, and that was sort of part of the inspiration for the Shade. But I found that, I don't know, I had a vein of morality in me that I didn't really realize I had. So slowly, as I've written the character over the years, I've slowly kind of given him more and more a sense of morality and a sense of doing the right thing, which he certainly didn't have at the start. And I think he was if the Shade would come to life and give me a good lecture, he would tell me how much he hates the fact that I made him into the man he is now, where he cares about people. But so that's part of it, and then Hope Daring, ending up with a girl that bites her fingernails, as she says in the miniseries, is not really probably where he intended to be, So it's interesting that I see more and more of me going into the Shade. At first, he was very much the person I wish I was, and I think now he's close to being kind of the person I am to some degree.
Well, and it's also interesting that he's portrayed as somebody who's very intellectual, very traveled, as you mentioned. And so, that's the kind of person that you maybe expect to be able to roll with the punches, but he's very set in his ways, and that's kind of, it rings very true. And so it's interesting to watch him deal with Hope, who is the kind of woman that he never would have met had he lived a normal lifetime. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. She is very much a woman of the present day. I mean, I'm not sure she even owns a dress, And
it's really fun watching him come to grips with that in a way that he ends up cherishing.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So that's the Shade. I was very happy in the end. I mean, I should always say, how grateful I am to readers. I made the risk. The book was not promoted, and it didn't sell at all. And there was a danger of being cancelled. And I told people there was that risk, because everyone, of course, also loves to trade weight, and I understand why that is, because comic books are expensive. But when you trade weight, you also run the risk of books never being going to trade because they're cancelled too soon.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, one of the saddest examples of that I ever saw was what was that miniseries that Tony Bedard did, the Great 10, the Chinese miniseries with Scott McDaniel artwork.
That sounds right.
Do you guys remember that? It was I thought a brilliant series. I think it's possibly the best thing Tony's ever written. Although I'm sure he probably would hate to be thought of in that way. But it sold so badly that they couldn't even afford to do the 10 issues. They've done 10 issues. They canceled in 9 issues, and it's never been collected because people trade waited. So anyway, I went. I said, the trade will be cancelled with issue 8 if you guys don't stop buying this book. And people stepped up, and sales held, and we got that collection out of it. It's a shame it wasn't hardcover, and I like the omnibuses, but at least it exists.
Mm-hmm.
It was just so great. So often in comics you can't go home again, but it was so nice to have new life breathed into that character, and to have an artist like Collie Hamner come step up and do some really fantastic pages to really bring that him back to life. It was just awesome.
Well, I was very worried about that, about going back. Whether you can go back. I did a series called Witchcraft, and it got Eisner nominations and whatnot. So they wanted a sequel, and I thought, this will be easy, and it wasn't. I mean, the second series is nowhere near as well done as the first, and it taught me then you have to be very careful about going back to something when you think you're finished with it. So I was very lucky that at least with the Shade, it really was like putting on a comfortable pair of shoes that I forgot I had. I could write him any time. Although I probably won't be writing him any time in the near future.
Is there something about the Shade as a character that makes him easy to go back to, or what is it that made the?
He's just so fun because he still is amoral. He still, he has no qualms about killing people if he feels they deserve it, and he's just he just says the things that you want to, like in the I mean, I'm glad they let me get away with it, but just like when the what's he called, the Inquisitor is talking about, he's calling all the fashion designers, feckless sodomites. And he says, it's very rude to my best friends are sodomites. Just like you get to say, he's the only character that could get to say a line like that, and it would work, So he's just fun to write for that reason.
I wanted to ask, as being someone who's interested in language, now, I guess when you started the series, you hadn't been in the U.S. for very long. And I noticed, as you're writing these American characters, some British ways of speaking kind of sneaking into their dialogue. I want just hear you talk about kind of the challenge of writing in a different dialect than your own.
Well, I mean, yes, that's a fair comment. You try and not fall prey to that, the Britishisms creeping in.
Mm-hmm.
And really, without wishing you do your best, and without wishing to pass the buck, it's also the job of your editor to catch that.
Mm.
And sometimes it slips through. And, sometimes people have always asked me about answers on a postcard. When
mm-hmm.
they ask Jack something and it goes answer on a postcard. That's very English. Only an English person would even get that reference. And I don't know why I put it in. And
well, I figured it must be a reference to some kind of TV or radio show where people are supposed to send in their answers. I caught that, but yes. I've never heard that expression used in that way before.
That is yes. Well, it's a very old British expression. It's always stuck in my mind only because the first time I watched The Prisoner, I was very young, and it was the first time it was ever repeated. It was on late at night, like midnight, and I would step and watch The Prisoner. And like everyone else, this is before the internet, and there were no books on The Prisoner. There was no fan books about The Prisoner. You couldn't get online and read about it. So literally watching The Prisoner for the first time for me, I didn't know what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
So with the very last episode where he gets out and he gets a little midget, they're skipping across the street, and he gets, there's really no explanation at the end. And it was like, okay, and then at the end of all British TV, you have a person come at the end and say, well, this is the end of tonight's viewing, and this is back when TV stopped at 2 in the morning or 1 in the morning.
Mm.
This is the end of our show, our night, and we'll see you in the morning, blah blah. And this guy said, okay, this is the last episode of The Prisoner, answers on a postcard. As if, he had no idea either. And it was so, for the time in British TV, irreverent thing for a guy to say. It just always stuck with me. So that's how that ended up in Starman. But so, and I know, and so that was a little bit deliberate. And I reasoned, I think, in my head, as I recall, that Jack was enough of a sort of pop culture guy and enough of a British, a British music guy. It was at the punk and everything else. That was, at an earlier point. That in the way that like some Americans get very into like the way British say things and British slang and British shows and music and whatnot. I could let these things slip in from time to time, and it wouldn't be the end of the world. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, if it's to the point where it's like too much, that's where the editor should step in. And I think Archie, God bless him, gave me a lot of like free reign to do what I wanted, which was appreciated and I think helped to make Starman the book it was.
Mm-hmm. And also, the title of Volume 9 is a French expression that I was not familiar with until I looked it up online, and I'm not even sure how to pronounce it. Grand something.
Grand Guignol.
Guignol, okay. And I guess that refers to some sort of, usually a horror story, or
yes, well, there was a French. It was like low drama, and it was the French, made an art form of it where it was working class drama, and they didn't want Ibsen and the Cherry Orchard and whatnot. They wanted blood and gore and everything else, and rape and death, and so there was so there would be these incredibly violent stories, and there's actually a theatre group in San Francisco called the Thrill Peddlers, who every season they get old plays, translate them and put them on. So I mean, I've seen a lot of Grand Guignol since arriving in San Francisco, and inevitably they find ways of showing disemboweling. I mean, amazing how they do it, like disembowelings and. There's always nudity, and I remember there was a Jack the Ripper, and it was brilliant how they did it in this show. I saw this quite recently, actually. And this girl is completely nude except for a corset. So she feels completely vulnerable. But within the corset, they'd hidden, like, entrails. So the guy stabs her in her corset and starts pulling her entrails out on stage. And it's happening before your eyes, and absolutely shocking. So this is what they would do. They would do nightly at the Grand Guignol. These bloody, dark stories with jealousy and rage and jealous husbands, and I saw one where it was all set in the 30s in Asia, and it was all sort of spies at first and seemed very civilized, but two of the spies are having an affair, and it ends with like one woman's eyes ripped out and this Asian slave girl like stripped to the waist and all the flesh peeled off her back and there's blood everywhere. I mean, so that was the idea for the ending of Starman in this city that had this French element to its history was all the blood, all the drama, all the death. All the things that everything was building towards was that final arc.
Earlier on, there's the story with the poster with the demon in it that pulls people in, and then at the end of that story, everybody who had been pulled in gets out of the poster, and you've got all these people from various time periods who are now in Opal City, and now obviously you had a lot of characters from the present already who you were trying to keep track of, but I was a little surprised that aside from Hamilton Drew, don't recall any other characters who we really learned about who had gotten out of the poster.
No, we didn't. It was one too many plot threads, honestly. Yeah. I should have. No, I didn't know. There wasn't anything else, except I will say that. And again, I doubt this will ever happen, but Tony and I talked about, if you look at the continuity, for any other adventures to happen for Jack, after that issue where they come out of the poster to the very end, there is no space for any more big months in time. It's pretty chronologically linked.
Right, and then he's out in space for so long, too.
so we had this idea that, I had this idea of doing this story where this one, this is what the story would be of this graphic novel, and Tony and I have talked about doing it, but like I say, if we do anything together, we have been talking about it, it probably won't be Starman. But it was going to be that through his links to tattoos, he meets an old Japanese man who's been yanked in the poster, who just wants to go back to Japan and like have his final years there. He's clearly close to dying, and he has a little piece of land, and he just wants to live on it. And as a favor, Jack agrees to escort the guy back to Japan. And however, in the time since the guy has been in the poster, his family has had this land taken away from him by the Yakuza and everything else. And then there would be sort of, Japanese river demons and ghosts and all of that sort of fantastic Japanese horror that exists, both in sort of old stories and old fiction, as well as Japanese horror of the 60s. So it was going to be Jack taking on the Yakuza, as well as all the Japanese supernatural elements. That was going to be, and it would jump back and forth. So there would be Tony doing painted, the kind of style he has now, and then also, those nice pen drawings and the stuff that's very, very much more traditional Japanese. So that's the story you're never going to get that we would have told.
Tim, that sounds like something you would have hated.
Well,
and
that explains why when the first time he meets Charity, she predicts that he's going to go to the Far East.
Yes, that was the plan.
Okay.
So we didn't. So and there were things like he was also going to be Hawkman as a reference to that, and then for one reason or another that didn't happen because because DC at the time was like in the process of fucking up Hawkman worse than they'd ever done before. So I just didn't want to have anything to do with it. But that was that was the intention, and that never happened. So what I've just described, imagine the best version of that in your own head, and you can tell your own story, your own version of it.
Okay. So in the last volume, Jack basically retires, and we talked about this a little bit already, but that's pretty unusual situation to have a hero just completely give up crime fighting and retire.
Right, because usually they either die or they keep doing it forever. So to have them just make a conscious decision like that is I can't think of another example.
Well, that was always meant as a metaphor for basically just growing up.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So when he decides to, accept his life as a father and start the new chapter in his life, it really is like putting away the childish things and going on to, and he moves to a really cool real city in America, but he basically leaves the fairy tale that is Opal City and goes into the world. And that was, there's intended deep symbolism to all of that.
Okay.
And do you, in having made that decision, it sounds like you had it planned for a long time, but are there times where you wished that Jack Knight was still around in the DCU, or you mentioned that if he was, he'd be so different that it wouldn't really be the same thing? So are you glad you? Well,
I'm very glad he's not around. I guarantee you, and God willing, it was somebody like Jeff or Grant Morrison writing and the further events of Jack Knight if I wasn't doing it. But I can almost guarantee it would be some fucking hack that would just fuck it all up, because that's how fate works. So I'm glad that
I shouldn't submit my Jack Knight pitch to DC, is what you're saying. So keep him off the table. I'm just glad that DC was kind enough to do that, And I'm not necessarily particularly happy with DC at the moment, but I'm very grateful that they chose to do that, and I always feel that way. The one thing I asked this question a bit tongue-in-cheek. The last time you and I talked about Starman in depth was for my podcast, Science Sort Of, where I focused far more on the science, particularly Ted Knight, his role as a scientist and how you wrote a scientist character. So I have to ask, Ted Knight versus Reed Richards.
I have to be honest, and this isn't just because I'm I'm writing FF now, it's Reed Richards. Because, I mean, Ted Knight, I mean, this is more the example of things that you should be picking to pieces. It is, like, during the war, why was there only one cosmic rod? Why wasn't there, like, thousands? Why wasn't every GI given a cosmic rod?
Well, yeah, that's back to my other point about why wasn't World War II or something like that transformed much more than it was in a superhero universe?
Because Hitler had the Spear of Destiny, Tim.
Okay.
At DC, yeah, but the, yeah, well, I mean, and that's it. You have to come up with reasons to explain that sort of thing. But I will say that, potentially, they've never really continued on. I mean, in theory, the DC universe in the aftermath of Ted Knight should have changed forever in terms of, there would be no Al-Qaeda because there would be no reliance on oil, which would ultimately fund them, because it would all be cosmic energy. The whole world would be different. So
there'd be no 9/11. Yeah.
If you think about all of that, you go nuts. But so Ted Knight would have changed the world in terms of his contribution. He was the Edison of his time, or the one of the great inventors. But Reed Richards invented so many things and has changed the Marvel world in so many ways and continues to do so. I think that the way that Ted Knight thinks is probably a lot more linear, whereas Reed Richards thinks in a much more liquid way. So I would have to say Reed Richards over... Or I'll put it this way. I think potentially Reed Richards could create what Ted Knight has created, and I don't know that Ted Knight could create everything that Reed Richards has created.
I like that. That's a nice little Venn diagram way of describing it.
Okay. So when's the first issue of your Fantastic Four coming out?
February.
Okay.
I don't know the actual week, but the first issue of Invaders, which eventually will get into legacy characters, funnily enough, we're talking about those, is in January, and then the following month, Fantastic Four starts. But like I say, it could be first week or the last week of February, I have no idea.
Okay. And the side series FF that's going away?
I'm sorry, the what?
So, like when Hickman was doing it, he had Fantastic Four series and the FF series, and Fraction continued doing both of them.
Oh, I see. Yes, no, there's going to be one, but I'm going to keep all those characters, all those plates spinning. And what's interesting with especially Fantastic Four, it's the first time, and assuming the book keeps selling, and as a result they keep me on the book, and all of that. By the time I'm on it, which will be a couple of years, much like Starman, I have moments. I've already got moments in my head for every one character to come through at certain points and shine in ways that I think will surprise people and touch their hearts. So I've already. So I'm excited about Fantastic. I'm excited about both books. I love writing the Invaders. I won't lie, but they feel very different. And Fantastic Four, I'm hoping, especially if Leonard and I have a long run together. I think it will be the next thing I'm really, really, really remembered for.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Yeah. Great. Sounds good.
There's a starman waiting in the sky.
Starman is published by DC. There are several ways you can keep up with the show or get in touch with us. You can follow us on Blue Sky at Decon Comics. On Facebook, we have both a page and a group. I'd recommend the group as being a bit more interesting. Those are linked from deconstructingcomics.com, as is our YouTube channel, where our episodes are posted every week as videos of a single image. You can comment on our episodes on YouTube or on our site, or drop us a line at mail@deconstructingcomics.com, or talk to us. Click the Leave a Voicemail link on the left sidebar of our site at deconstructingcomics.com. Are you making a comic? Send it to us and we'll do a Critiquing Comics episode about it. What you're hearing now is, of course, Starman by David Bowie. The music backing the promotion of our Patreon is Change by Jazar. It's been a while since we touched on the topic of comics journalism, the reporting of information via comics. One of the best-known practitioners of this is Joe Sacco, And next week, in an all-new episode, Kumar and Dana will touch on several of Sacco's works highlighting the seemingly unsolvable Middle East situation, Palestine, footnotes in Gaza, and his latest, War on Gaza. That's next week. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.